Damen und Herren, herzlich willkommen. We switch to English as we have an English guest today. We are very happy to have Professor Paul Collier with us. He's one of the leading migration experts in the world. He's Professor of Economics and Public Policy at the University of Oxford. Research covers the causes and consequences of civil war, the effects of aid, and the problems of democracies in low-income and natural resources-rich countries. Professor Collier is currently advisor to the Strategy and Policy Department of the IMF, advisor to the Africa region of the World Bank. He writes for the New York Times, the Financial Times, and also for the Washington Post. And recently he gave a series of interviews in German-speaking countries. Is Merkel jointly responsible for the refugee crisis? Who else? Mr. Collier asks in the German newspaper Die Welt. He argues that the refugee crisis is broken, and now he's going to tell us how to fix it. Sir Collier, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much. With that introduction, let me start by saying I'm flying to Berlin straight from this meeting where I'm working with the German government on their G20. Germany is the chair of the G20 for the coming year, and the German government has very kindly invited me to help craft the strategy for that based around economic assistance for Africa and a partnership with Africa. So I'm working with the German government. I'm not a critic of the German government. So what I'm going to talk about today is the refugee crisis and what to do about it. I'm going to start with what I regard as the central question, which is an ethical question of what is the ethical response to the refugee problem. You can think of this as what is Austria's ethical response, right? I can think of what is Britain's ethical response. It's not a particularly European issue, it's a global issue. And the ethics we need to draw on to understand the moral imperative for helping refugees is the concept known as the duty of rescue. And the duty of rescue is an overriding duty. It's exemplified by the example of you're walking along and you pass a pond and there is a child drowning in the pond. And what is your ethical responsibility? And it's obvious what your ethical responsibility is, right? It's obvious to almost everybody, everywhere, right? Psychologists estimate that about 3% of the world's population is psychopathic, right? So we set aside the psychopaths, and the other 97% of us have a normal, instinctive human reaction to the child in the pond. We don't stand there and saying, I didn't push it in. We don't say, where are those rotten parents that let the child fall into the pond? It's their responsibility. We don't stand there and say, I've just put my best suit on. Nor is the child screaming from the pond, I demand my rights. Right? The child is saying, help, and the instinctive human response of 97% of us is the compassion, which means we get in that pond, we get that child out. Right? Refugees are not migrants. The part of Europe's terrible confusion is to muddle up those two concepts. There is no moral right to to migrate. There's no moral right to go and live in any country you choose to live in. Right? I work 90% of the time on Africa, and I'm very proud. I've just been on the board of the Bank of Botswana, their national bank. Botswana, 40 years ago, dirt poor country, dirt poor, one of the poorest countries in Africa, landlocked, semi-arid, diamonds, but the other diamond country in Africa, Sierra Leone, the diamonds crashed the society to the bottom of the world's Human Development Index. Botswana, very prudent, sensible management. It managed to harness those diamonds for economic development. Required very good, careful governance. Meanwhile, Nigeria, over $1 trillion of oil, and it's as poor as the day it discovered the oil. You know? So Botswanans are now per capita at least 10 times richer than Nigerians. You know, if you believe there's a moral right for Nigerians to go and live in Botswana, you better tell the Botswanans, because they certainly don't think so. Nor do they think that I've got a moral right to go and live in Botswana. Right? I don't, and they wouldn't let me. Right? It's a lovely place, incidentally. But that's just an example to say, obviously, there's no moral right to choose whichever country you might like to live in. You know, so the duties towards migrants, or would-be migrants, are an order of magnitude different from our duty of rescue towards refugees. If I'd got more time, I would talk about our duty of rescue towards the people who want to migrate, and it's not zero. The duty is basically to do what we can to bring credible hope to people in their own societies. That's what we're trying to do with the G20. But today I want to talk about the refugees, and the duty of rescue for refugees is analogous to get the child out of the pond. Now what you're doing with getting the child out of the pond, and then you get it dry, right? Then you try and find their parents and so on and so forth. What you're trying to do is basically restore normality. And that is our core duty of rescue to refugees. Try and restore normality as far as is possible. And just to delve a little bit into the idea that refugees are not migrants. First of all, the motivation for leaving home is totally different. A migrant leaves home in hope. Right? Refugees don't leave home in hope. They leave home in fear. In fact, refugees are a subset of the fundamental problem, which is displacement. Around the world, there are 65 million people displaced through fear, mainly caused by disorder, sometimes famine. These are sort of group phenomena, you know, societies in collapse. There are about 50 fragile states in the world, and at any one time, one or other of them melts down, and that's the displacement phenomenon. And then about a third of the displaced cross an international border and then become classified as refugees. But the core phenomenon is displacement. There are 20 million refugees in the world. Displacement from refugees is at an all-time high since 1945 at the moment. So this is not a problem that is tapering out. This is a problem that is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. And so we need international strategies that adequately meet that duty of rescue. And we've manifestly not got them. So just to persist with the distinction between refugees and migrants, migrants are leaving home in hope, refugees are leaving home in fear, and then where do they go to? Let me tease you for a moment. What do you think are the top refugee hosting countries? Anybody want? Sorry? Sweden. Thank you very much. Right? Yeah. The Europe tends to, I tease you because very often I get the responses are, the Germans say Germany, the Swedes say Sweden, and so on and so forth. Europe is sort of utterly self-obsessed. Right? It is, anyway, that's a different story. But the top, there are 10 haven countries where a majority of refugees are. Right? And the top one on earth is Pakistan. Right? Close second, Iran. Right? These are not, none of these countries is a country that's a honeypot country. This is not where, if you're a migrant, you say, let's go to Pakistan. You know? In fact, all 10 of the haven countries are countries of emigration. You know, they're not very nice places. Why are they haven countries? Not because they're particularly generous to refugees. It's because they're close to places of conflict. They're all safe-ish locations in very disordered regions. And at any one time, only maybe one or two of the countries in the disorderly region will have imploded, and from time to time, one country gets back into peace, and another melts down in a conflict. And so the national population of the refugees changes, but they all go to these same 10 haven countries. Right? So the core of the refugee problem is to deal with the refugees in the haven countries. That's where they are, for the very simple reason that's the easiest place to get to, and what overwhelmingly refugees want is fully to restore normality, meaning they pray that when peace is restored, they can then go back. And we're just not, we're not meeting these core needs of refugees in the havens. The international architecture on this is a mixture of an agency, UNHCR, and a convention, the Geneva Convention. And both are radically unsuited to the problem we've got. They are the last unreformed legacies of the late 1940s, early 1950s, when the refugee problem was totally different. Right? The refugees in the late 1940s in Europe were in transit, and so what they needed was food and shelter. And that's what UNHCR was designed to do. It was a humanitarian agency to provide food and shelter for refugees in transit. And it is indeed a purely humanitarian agency, and it gradually discovered that the most efficient way to provide temporary food and temporary shelter was camps. Right? Globally, 90% of refugees ignore UNHCR. For a very simple reason, that is not the priority of most refugees. Right? The typical refugee is a refugee for about 10 years, give or take. It's not permanent, but it's certainly not just short-term. Imagine if you were a refugee with your family, you'd fled from fear. What is your priority? Right? Your first priority is safety, so you go to either another part of the country that's safe, or you get across the border to a place that's safe. And then what is your priority? You know that you're not going back anytime soon. You dream of going back. Right? But it's going to be a long haul. And your first priority is to restore some shreds of normality, which fundamentally means try and restore a degree of autonomy. You've lost control of your life. You want to try and re-establish some autonomy over your life. And the foundation of that is you need to be able to earn a living. If you can earn a living, you can feed your family, you can house your family, you can make decisions above all. And that's why 90% of global refugees ignore UNHCR, because UNHCR inadvertently infantilizes refugees. When I've only been working on this 2 years. I was brought in by the government of Jordan 2 years ago to say, what can we do? Because they got a million refugees and they were receiving very little help from the international community. And so the government of Jordan had been plunged into fiscal crisis. And so they took me around the camps and that sort of thing. I was deeply shocked by what I saw. I mean, materially, the camps are fine. I work in African slums. My main thing at the moment is African urbanization. And compared to an African slum, a refugee camp in Jordan is luxury. They've got carpets, televisions, but it is soul destroying. They have nothing to do. They have nothing to do. I remember talking with a refugee family, saying, 16-year-old kid, be in school? No school. So what do you do? Oh, the housework. The house is a porter cabin. Right? And then, have you got any brothers or sisters? Yeah, I've got an 18-year-old brother. What's he doing? He's gone back to Syria. What's he doing in Syria? 18-year-old young man in Syria at the moment, don't ask, right? I mean, it's just a question of which group is he killing with, right? That's the reality we're confronting, right? And so, in fact, whilst I was just to continue, I've got a book coming out on this with my co-author Alex Betts as the director of the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford, which is the biggest refugee studies centre in the world. And so we're trying with the book to change global refugee policy. But whilst we were doing this tour of the refugee camps and so on, to be honest, the Jordanian government wasn't particularly interested in the refugee camps, but it was very proud of what it was doing to develop Jordan. So it said, we've got time to see what we've done for Jordan. Will you come and see it? So we just visited the biggest refugee camp there is, Zaatari. 90,000 people sitting there doing nothing. Right? And 15 minutes away is this huge King Abdullah industrial zone, fully equipped, electricity, all the rest of it, logistics, infrastructure, and it's 90% empty. Right? Oh, what should we do? I mean, you don't have to be an economist at Oxford to work this out. You all got it in 30 seconds. I mean, these 90,000 people should be working in this big industrial zone. Right? Why aren't they? So that's what we then started to discuss with the government of Jordan. And the Minister for Economic Development, very sensible enlightened guy, said, first of all, we can't just let Syrian refugees take jobs. We'd be out of power. There's not enough jobs for Jordanians. You think refugees are a political problem in Austria? Try Jordan, right? Where there are 1 million and a small population. Right? And so we thought through this and said, well, what about if a lot of European businesses came and brought jobs to the zones, new jobs, and some of those jobs were for Jordanians and some were for refugees? Would you be interested then? Jordanian government started to think, this could be an opportunity. It's not necessarily a nightmare and a burden. It could be an opportunity for us to get out of the middle income trap. So we crafted this into an idea and it got political traction. So the Jordanian government said, we'll go to 200,000 work permits as long as the jobs come in. So 200,000 work permits for refugees, as long as you can do it sort of something like 70% refugees jobs, 30% Jordanian jobs. One problem which we overcame was that if you produced goods in Jordan, you couldn't sell them into Europe because the European community had trade barriers against Jordan. We went to Brussels, the European Commission saw the case for doing something, so they've now given 10 years free market access to Jordan. That's enough to get things going. So the trade barriers are no longer a problem. And then we went to the World Bank, which I used to be the director of research at the World Bank, and so I know my way around it. So I said, what are you doing in Jordan? And they said, nothing. We can't do anything in Jordan because Jordan, if you look at the league tables, Jordan is per capita income, it's an upper middle income country, and the World Bank doesn't do anything in upper middle income countries, it's not allowed to. Where our business is poverty and the poor are in the poor countries, and Jordan, there's 1 million refugees. It's not aid for Jordan, it's aid to address a refugee problem, which if you do it right, can then be incubating the post-conflict Syrian economy. Will you be doing post-conflict in Syria? You bet, right? There'll be billions of World Bank money for post-conflict Syria. Well, why not spend some of that money before the conflict's over, incubating some business that employs the Syrian refugees so that when the peace comes, the Syrian refugees can go back to Syria and the businesses with them. The board wouldn't allow it. Why not try the board? I was in the World Bank last month, and I'm proud to say they had tried. They put together a loan for Jordan, for in the industrial zones, to create refugee jobs, and they put it to the board, and the guys who'd done it reported back to me. They said it was extraordinary. Normally, when loans go to the board nitpicks here, nitpicks there, and a few people just sort of cause trouble. In this case, everybody wanted to speak, and everybody wanted to say, my constituency supports this project. So at last, World Bank policies changed. The most shocking thing is that is the first money the World Bank has ever put into refugees, ever. In the same board meeting, they did a loan for Lebanon. So it's starting down the road of getting things right. But it's absolutely in its infancy. And the reason the World Bank had stayed out was not just that Jordan was upper middle income, but that the UNHCR basically had a monopoly. If it was anything to do with refugees, UNHCR. And the problem with that is UNHCR is a purely humanitarian agency. Right? Remember what it does: food, shelter, camps. Its whole funding model is short-term crisis response. Wait till there's a crisis that hits the TV screens, then rattle the tin. That is a hopeless funding model for the problem they've got, long-term refugees. But it's not just a hopeless funding model, it's a hopeless model. Because remember, the core priority is jobs, and they don't do anything economic. So there are 9,000 staff in UNHCR, they're lawyers and anthropologists. You either sack 90% of them and rehire with MBAs who can go and talk to the business world, or you just say, well, let's let the economic agencies we've got around the world deal with this, which seems to be the quicker solution, frankly. So we need to get decisions on refugees out of courtrooms, this model of individual rights of individual refugees being persecuted by governments, which is the Geneva Convention. That was right in 1948 when the basic ideas got set. It was the opening act in the Cold War when the Iron Curtain came across Europe. Right? The modern refugee problem is not mostly about governments persecuting individuals. It's about the collapse of government, leaving whole vast groups of people in fear of their lives. And so it's completely inappropriate to do individuals in a courtroom. You need group solutions that actually address this duty of rescue to the group. None of the 10 governments of the regional haven countries where the refugees are, none of them are signatories to the Geneva Convention. So it's just not addressing the core problem. It's appropriate for that there are a subgroup of refugees who indeed are being persecuted individually. And so the Geneva Convention is absolutely fit and proper for that problem. But it was never designed for and cannot work for the mass refugee problem that we're now facing. To get back to the thread of the argument, I'm going to close up. The duty of rescue towards refugees should not be contentious. 97% of the population should buy into this. And so the fact that Austria is so disastrously polarized at the moment, I see as a symptom of you're disagreeing about the wrong phenomenon. Right? Whatever you're disagreeing about, it's not about the duty of rescue towards refugees. Because if you properly define that problem, which is a very real problem, you'd be absolutely unified on it. And then, once you were unified, the real important aspect of getting a 97% consensus is that if you can get that sort of consensus, you can actually do stuff. Whilst you're polarized, nothing happens. And I'm a practical guy who wants practical action that actually fulfills this duty of rescue. And that means build a big consensus. And it is entirely feasible. And it's because Europe has obsessed about the wrong phenomenon, the trickle of refugees getting to Europe, that it's missed the elephant. And so we think that our response to refugees is about the handful of refugees in Europe. That's where we're spending virtually all the budget. Right? We spend 135 euro on a refugee in Europe for every euro we spend on a refugee in the havens. Right? And the refugees in Europe are obviously the better off. How did they get to Europe? By buying a place with a people smuggler that was very expensive relative to Syrian per capita income. So what we've got is the better off. That is not, none of that is an excuse for any narrative of hostility to the refugees, let alone the immigrants in our own society. Obviously not. That should go without saying, but unfortunately doesn't. But it does mean that to address the core phenomenon of refugees is not about the handful of people in Europe. It's about bringing jobs and bringing money to those regional havens. Thanks so much.